So I know that everyone hears how important protein is, but it's often thought of simply as just a building block for the structures inside of our body. But I think the signaling roles of the proteins that we eat are almost just as important. So protein is made of different amino acids, and amino acids are kind of like bricks, and proteins are kind of like a house. And when we eat protein, we break it down inside of our intestinal tract into its individual amino acids, and we absorb these amino acids. And then in order to make muscle or body proteins, we kind of just put these amino acids right back together. And in this way, these amino acids play a structural role inside of our body proteins. However, some of these amino acids, specifically an amino acid called leucine, actually has signaling roles in our body for promoting protein synthesis and muscle growth. So inside of our cells, we have two specific proteins. One's called AMPK and the other is called mTOR. At baseline, when we aren't eating, AMPK is going to be active and mTOR is going to be inhibited. And AMPK is responsible for a process called protein turnover. And this is actually the process of kind of breaking down and rebuilding our muscles periodically throughout the day. And it's estimated that 7 out of every 8 amino acids that we break down are reused for protein synthesis. And this process is definitely important because oftentimes we're actually breaking down some of the damaged or misfolded proteins and recycling them into new healthy proteins. However, as I mentioned, we lose about 1 out of every 8 amino acids in this process. And this is shown by the fact that when we're not eating protein, we're actually in a state of net protein loss throughout the entire day. Meaning that yes, technically when we're fasting, our muscles will be shrinking throughout that entire period of time. But as I mentioned, this process is very important. We don't just want to accumulate proteins, we want to accumulate healthy functional proteins. And to do so, we risk losing a few amino acids in the process. However, when we eat protein, we actually inhibit the AMPK molecule and activate mTOR. And if I didn't mention it already, AMPK and mTOR are also made out of amino acids. But what mTOR does is it actually activates the process of protein synthesis by activating transcription factors that are responsible for synthesizing new muscle proteins. And it also has a host of other different effects that actually allow these proteins to be implemented into the muscle tissue. But it's very important to know that one of, if not the most potent stimulator of mTOR is going to be the amino acid leucine. And this is an elegant mechanism because leucine is contained in the majority of the proteins that we eat. So leucine is kind of the signal that there are amino acids inside of our body that can be used for protein synthesis. And the more leucine that's around, the more of the signal that will be sent. There is a limit simply because we only have so many of these mTOR molecules available. And this limit appears to be at around 5 grams of leucine, which you would obtain from eating 25 grams of protein coming from any animal source protein such as beef, poultry, fish, and eggs. And one of the issues with plant-based proteins is that the amount of leucine inside of these proteins is much less than an animal source protein. So let's say you eat a meal containing 25 grams of plant protein, but you only get in 2 grams of leucine. There may be enough amino acids around to maximize protein synthesis, but if there's not enough leucine, we don't have a great enough signal to maximize protein synthesis. And this could mean that excess amino acids could stay inside of our bloodstream and won't be used for protein synthesis. And unfortunately, the body doesn't have another store for amino acids, so commonly we'll turn them into glucose inside of the liver. And now this isn't a bad thing, but it's kind of like wasting protein. So while overall quantity of protein is probably going to be the most important factor, quality of protein could actually play roles in the signaling cascades that occur inside of your body. And the last thing I'll mention is actually what's referred to as the muscle full effect. And this is why we can't just kind of have a constant infusion of amino acids throughout the entire day. And it's actually better to split up protein into consistent meals periodically throughout the day with gaps in between of about 2 to 3 hours. Simply, if we're constantly eating amino acids, for some reason the cell becomes less responsive. And it's kind of like we need to give the cell a periodic break of at least 2 to 3 hours between meals in order for our next ingestion of protein to have the same signaling effects. And unfortunately, the exact mechanisms and reasons for this aren't quite yet determined. But it definitely is a phenomenon that if we dose people with 25 grams of amino acids every hour, the rates of protein synthesis are not as large when they're dosed every 2 to 3 hours. So the recommendation I always give for people trying to maximize muscle growth is going to be 4 to 5 meals evenly spaced throughout the day, and each of these meals containing 25 or more grams of protein coming from one of the quality sources I mentioned, which are going to be things like poultry, fish, eggs, and beef. And if you are going to use plant proteins, making sure that you know the types and amounts of amino acids inside of these proteins. So not only are you ensuring you're getting enough leucine, but you're also getting enough of all of the other amino acids. But fortunately, if you're eating animal products, you don't really have to worry about this as much, as long as you're eating about 25 grams of protein per meal.